Quiet and full of whispered things, the dusk and dry creeks settled like ash over a battlefield. Orange bled in the sky, behind the half-dead cottonwood's black bones. Additionally, the town appeared to hold its own under that waning light. Take a breath. Fast and Dry Creek never happened. Not even the brutality. It simmered. It waited for the appropriate hearts to shatter, the appropriate eyes to observe, and the appropriate ears to hear. That's how Elizabeth Granger was involved. She was 17 years old. Her name was changed that summer to Quiet. She used to laugh like storm season and wind chimes before that. Erratic, abrupt, and a little too loud. As she carried buckets from the well, she would hum. Sun on her, dirt on the hem of her skirt, arms with freckles. Her father, a quiet guy with tired eyes who kept a Bible on the counter and operated the basic shop, was more out of habit than faith. Years prior, her mother had passed away due to a fever and buried outside town under a twisted willow. Elizabeth was reported to have her mother's eyes. She discovered that she shouldn't take something as a compliment. That April, she began to come along the river under the command. Figures in shadow against the bone-white dawn. On the ridge line, silent riders never crossed but constantly observed. In Dry Creek, most people cursed the observations. He was referred to as God's reminder that the wilderness still existed among them by Reverend Desire Pute. Clayton Voss, sheriff, he spat tobacco juice near the church steps and wiped his firearm. Additionally, Elizabeth curious more than afraid. She observed from a hill where the wild poppies flourished. The morning of late May was when she first saw him. Tacoma. At the time, she was unaware of his name. He was by himself. A long cut of blood ran down his arm as he kneeled close to the water. He didn't suit the rumors in some way. He didn't appear crazy. He appeared to be a young man attempting to stop his bleeding. Instead of walking away, she took a step slowly forward, shielded by her skirt. Startled but composed, he turned. And across a little brook, they gazed at one another. She took a piece of fabric out of her pocket and threw it. An old red, frayed ribbon came toward him. He accepted it silently, tightened it around his wound, and gave one nod. That was all. Not a word. No thank you. Simply acknowledgement and quiet. Heart pounding in her chest, she walked away without another look. Just as if it were stolen. She went back to the creek for days after that, feigning to collect wild mint. He never showed up. Then one night, she discovered she left her green, silky footsteps on a polished stone that was only found upstream. She tucked it in, like it was sacred, into the pocket of her apron. She had trouble sleeping that night. Her physique felt too hot for her body temperature. Dry Creek took note. Such towns usually do. The foul, suffocating whispers came like smoke. The chapel's Mrs. Blevins claimed to have witnessed Elizabeth conversing with shadows. According to Widow Hatch, the girl had Indian sickness. Someone discovered that on a fence post next to the South Trail, a red ribbon tangled. That was sufficient. The Reverend Pute called her dad. While Elizabeth stood outside, holding her, they conversed behind closed doors. Her hands grew white from the force of the skirt. She realized there was a problem when after that, her father refused to look at her. The Bible disappeared from the store counter that evening. Her father's voice. After 2 days, Sheriff Voss arrived. He wasn't by himself. 2 stern-eyed men and the calloused hands of rope stood next to him. The door crashed open while Elizabeth was sifting cornmeal in the back room. Her name was not called. She had no time to shout because of them. She pulled a burlap sack over her head. The dusty her feet kicked pointless air before becoming motionless as world turned dark. She awoke in a barn filled with the stench of horses and hatred. The bag was gone. Straw adhered to her mouth. Her wrists were chafe raw and her arms were bound behind her. Boots were heard by her. Change. Someone struck a match. She caught a glimpse of Voss's serene face in the flash. Methodical, as if he were cutting the wick from a candle. In the coals, one of the others held something metal. It was glowing. Red. When the fire caressed it, it hissed. "We're not doing this for vengeance," Virginia flatly. She cried out, "We're doing this so no man ever forgets." Branded her. She didn't feel the discomfort. Like a fire road, it struck her spirit. Into her bones. Curving cruelly, the word taken was engraved just over her hip. Across her abdomen like an unbreakable lie. She was left in the straw once they finished cutting the cords. Trembling and fractured, no one arrived to assist her. Then no. By daybreak, She scurried from the barn. Her legs were covered in blood. She had a garment that clung to her waist. She did not cry. Somewhere in the dark, the tears were already dried. She strolled, walking barefoot by the store, the chapel, and the schoolhouse where she once wished to become a teacher. No one gave her a glance. The hate wasn't as bad as that. The air had engulfed her in its absence. Complete. She was discovered. By the willow by Widow Wren. The elderly woman remained silent, simply covered her with a frayed comforter and guided her to the town's edge, where a dilapidated cabin jutted out like it had lost the ability to stand. "You stay out here," Wren replied soothingly. "The sky is not theirs." Elizabeth gave a nod. Her tone was gone, buried with a ribbon, shattered. She stayed in the cabin for weeks. Wren brought food for her to eat, roots, water, and an old bread crust. After festering, her wound became scarred. She followed it at night with fingers that shake, as though she could reduce its guilt by knowing its shape. She was unable to. The community went on. Without her, there were weddings. There were offspring. The church bell rung. Sundays, but occasionally a rock is thrown at her cabin door. The wood was carved by someone. She repeatedly wiped it down with a rag, until the word disappeared. However, the sensation persisted. Once more, summer arrived. The poppy's wild flowers blossomed on the hill. Elizabeth started walking farther every day, cautiously, constant observation. Her hair became knotted and lengthy. She discovered how to patch her garment with old hide and fix the roof with bark cloth. She talked to herself alone, song fragments, ancient prayers, and names she was unable to forget. While gathering water, one twilight, she saw him once more. Tacoma. He remained still beneath the cottonwoods. He had an older, carved face. Silently by the sun, the bucket slipped out of her hands and splashed as she froze. In opposition to her feet, they remained silent. He gave her the impression that everything had changed and nothing had. She spun around and took off running. A cleaned, gutted, and fresh rabbit was found outside her door the following morning. She took it up after staring at it for a while. The rumor began again throughout town. The Reverend Pute roared about judgment and flames. One afternoon, Sheriff Voss stopped by her cabin, leaned, and gazed at the fence post. He simply spat, close to her flowers without saying anything. Left. Elizabeth remained unflinching. She had a dream about Red Ribbon that night in her river. Strange songs, occasionally songs, were born by the wind and dry brook. Nobody acknowledged hearing. Songs about things that couldn't be, lads and girls who didn't die, and retracted. One of these songs was playing when Elizabeth woke up, drifting into a shattered window, as though the sky was attempting to recall her name. Stepping out, she was barefoot. The temperature was warm. In the field, the poppies shuddered, and a man appeared exactly where the globe curved into wilderness, far beyond the ridgeline. On horseback, observed her. He made no gesture. He remained silent. But deep inside, she sensed a change. Not pardon. A start, but not yet. Additionally, Dry Creek's beginnings were as uncommon as rain in the spring. The dry stream mornings arrived slowly, akin to an elderly man emerging from a rigid bed, silent, reluctantly creaking. The barn had been gone for a year. Since the scar that was etched across Elizabeth Granger's stomach, since a scream that was sucked up by straw. Still, nobody is in if the town mentioned her at all. They said her name out loud. It appeared in sidelong glances, incomplete phrases, or steely gaze that slipped by her as if she were a blot on history. To them, she was not a person, but a warning. She no longer knew what she was to herself. Her boodle was no longer as tough as skin. Her hair was in a copper tangle and had gone wild. That landed on her shoulders like unquenchable fire. Her hands were constantly busy gathering, mending, and cutting, repairing. However, her voice stayed as silent as a grave beneath her mother's willow. Speaking was pointless to those who refused to respond. She resided in a dilapidated cottage outside of town, beyond the line where she could hear the chapel bell, but she no longer felt as though it was calling to her. The ceiling and floorboards were twisted, leaked in heavy rain, and a recalcitrant rabbit had excavated a home under the porch, seemingly identifying her as a fellow exile. However, she had claimed this small ruin as her own. She had made drapes out of flour bags and dried herbs by the even etch her name on the lintel over the door and break windows. Only the initial letter. She seemed to be relearning how to live in fragments. There was some fading of the scar. The word was still readable even when the pink flesh turned silver. Captured. A brand designed to rename as well as punish. She was not fond of the mirror, for what it recalled, but also for what it displayed. On certain evenings, she would lie awake with her fingers tracing beneath her patch quilt, the letters attempting to visualize their disappearance. On other nights, she had river-related dreams, and ribbon and flowers, but dreams were decadent, and she had long since put those up. Long time ago, the footprints followed. First, minor things, such moved dirt outside too narrow to be a settler's boot. The door was a faint print in the dust. Initially, it was the wind or the coyote, she assured herself. Then the bunny appeared. It was delicately placed next to her door, its skin spotless, still warm. It had been left by someone who knew what they were doing. She knelt next to it, hammering hard, and peered toward the edge of the ridge. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the cedar and the unending undergrowth. She spent a considerable amount of time staring at the offering before entering. The following morning, a soft, flexible, folded deer pelt neatly. The following day, a crimson beaded braid that matched the ribbon's precise hue had once given. A youngster who was bleeding beside to a creek. When Elizabeth touched it, her breath caught. Her hands shook. He had come back. Tacoma. It had been a year since she'd seen him up close. Not since that a second under the cottonwoods. Now, however, his quiet encircled her once again. Not his absence this time, but presence. He was observing her closely without making any inquiries. She didn't understand how to handle that. She had a tin cup of mint tea one evening while sitting outside. The light was going out. In the type bright light that made even broken objects lovely and blurred scars. Then she caught sight of him. Tacoma was standing on the brink of just beyond the slanting fence post in her tiny field. He wore the same serene. She recalled a silence like though he had grown from the soil. Not a weapon in sight, just his presence, motionless, fearless. She remained silent. He didn't either. He arrived at put a bundle on the ground and put it into his satchel. Smoked. Pork, dried maize, herb. She was unable to aim. Then he gave a single nod, turned, and left. Her throat was constricted. The scent of fire and pine filled the air. She sat by that evening, holding the red beads near her window, not crying, but in close proximity. Not as a result of sympathy, due to recognition. Someone hadn't turned away when they saw her. She started keeping a daily eye on the fence. He occasionally showed up, and occasionally did not. He left gifts when he did. When he didn't, she discovered that she had to fold the blanket closer to her shoulders as if the cold returned because he was not there. There was never a fence he crossed. She didn't either. Weeks went by after a few days. When she awoke one morning, her fence had been fixed. New twine, straight post, and repaired wood. He had carried it out in the middle of the night like a ghost caring for what others had left behind. She wanted to express her gratitude. Rather, he gave her rabbit hair, which she washed and hung hanging over the fence post in a strip. Hey, silent response. Town people began to take notice. The murmurs came back. In the bakery, Mrs. Blevins whispered about untamed men intruding where they're not welcome. A sermon on seductionists in disguise was given by Reverend Pute as an expression of thanks. Voss, sure, wrote in a single week, the pastor shacked twice. The second time, he placed a dark, jagged, pointy stone on her doorstep. Caution. She left it there as a challenge without touching it. She discovered a bone comb beside the window the following evening. Carefully carved, simple. It appeared to be from a different era. She waited. Her hands, and she ran something other than her own fingers through her hair for the first time. In more than a year. Little people change as a result of things. Slowly, like water over rock, but not all at once. She started humming once more, but only to herself and in the silence. But the melody filled the warmth of a cabin. She sewed her blanket and grew herbs under the window. Tighter, spent more time outside. She etched the remainder of her name onto the lintel over the entrance. Yelly Zobd is hers alone. It is neither broken nor claimed. The change was not ignored. Sheriff Voss returned, this time with a mission. He stood close to the fence with his rifle slung over his shoulder and his arms crossed, without getting off his horse. The word means, you have company. She remained silent. The town dislikes you, but I don't care what he leaves or what you believe he sees in you. Problem. He narrowed his gaze. All right, so you want to ride out here. However, if you bring, she gazed at him, saying, "You'll both burn if you get too close." Didn't flinch. Her tone was chilly. "I've already burnt once." In the dirt, Vospat turned and rode away. She didn't sleep that night, not because they were afraid, but because they were excited. She sat by while the moonlight turned the sky lavender. The window, holding her father's ancient Bible in her lap without opening it. She kind of thought he would come back. He didn't. The following, she discovered pebbles hurled at the hut and her herbs trampled underfoot. The term carved into the door once more. This time, she cleaned it more steadily and slowly, without feeling ashamed. She sat at dusk, observing the horizon outside once more. Then he was there. Tacoma, nearer than previously. He didn't stop at the fence this time. He crossed it and walked her stood in front of her at the cabin entrance. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs as she gazed up at him. Her scar was scorched, not from suffering, but recollection. He remained silent. He simply dropped to one knee, opened a sack gently, and placed 3 items on it. 1 fluffy white feather, a blanket, and a fire starter. Next, he got up slowly and turned to go. Before he vanished into the forest, she did not stop him. She said. He hesitated and turned slightly before saying, "Quiet, fragile, and whole. Tacoma." The scarlet beads around her neck were touched. "Thank you." After giving a single nod, he was gone. She sat at her table and sighed, grazing the edge of the feather with her fingers. It felt weightless and waiting, like a promise. Outside, the darkness became darker. Something ancient, something holy, not a recollection. A beginning was whispered by the wind across the ridge line. Like a sigh too weary to be heard, autumn slipped into the dry creek. The wind shifted. The cottonwoods burned gold before their leaves gave way. The evenings were long, and the dust was brittle. Elizabeth wrapped tighter in the blanket made from Tackhome's leftover hides. She frequently left her fingers on its seams, as even though there were secrets in the threads. Every stitch had evolved into a silent protest against a scar that had served as a form of prayer, declared her ruined. Her reflection started to look more like someone she could live with the more she wore it. The visits from Tacoma became routine, trusted, but not anticipated or daily. He never lingered or crossed a threshold. However, something changed each time he visited. Emotion, a fresh silence, a mutual understanding rooted on something more profound than words. It wasn't courtship. It was acknowledgement. He brought her a necklace one evening that was strung with carved bone and bits of obsidian. She considered it in her hands, without questioning its meaning. His eyes held her without searching or passing judgment. She wore it underneath the layers of her dress that housed the scar. There were brief instances that started to feel like breathing once more. She noticed that she was singing as she chopped firewood or chuckling to herself when a rabbit attempted to climb her boot beneath the porch. Widow Wren saw a shift and grinned silently. She now visited less frequently, always keeping food close to the door, as a mother would for a daughter, who didn't trust her but request comfort, but still required it. However, the empty brook and tranquility were fragile, the sort that has been wrongly breathed on by shatters. Word had gotten out once more. The crunch of Voss's boots echoed through her fence. The preacher's sermons were more intense. Elizabeth sensed the strain tightening and the weight of eyeballs on her skin, like too tightened rope. And then there was a knock. At Widow's door, not at hers. Wren's. Mrs. Blevins' self-righteousness and red face were the cause. He's coming at her, like a dog at night. She gives him food and allows him to stay. Do you believe it will end there? She's dragging him into her bed, don't you think? She was wearing beads, as I could see. Not the type that respectable women wear. Wren, her face stoned as she listened. Have you witnessed him touching her? I saw enough to understand the situation. Then perhaps, Wren said gently, you should turn your head away. 3 ranch hands rode by the following day. Elizabeth's cabin. Loud and slow. A stone was thrown at her door by one. An additional spit. To mock rather than to amuse, the third whistled a broken song. She got up, arms crossed, scar searing. Under her dress, still standing in the doorway. She didn't till they were gone, move. She discovered a symbol etched into her fence that evening. Pitch burn an X. Perhaps a promise, perhaps a warning. Next was Tacoma. Evening. She didn't hold off until he knocked. She left before he got to the gate, her spine and eyes keen. Straight. Her words, they're stirring up a fire again. He didn't answer right away. He looked across the horizon, then went back to her. I won't bring war to your door. It's already here. He said his own face was unreadable as he studied hers. She went on, almost boldly, I won't hide, herself, to mean it. He took a pouch from his belt, opened it, and gave her a tiny pendant that was carved of a wolf with soot-etched eyes. For courage, he stated plainly. She wrapped her fingers around it. The storm started 2 nights later. A bang against her door, followed by footsteps and a stir in the bushes. As she reached for the fire poker, the wood split open, revealing Sheriff Vost standing there with the lantern up. He swept his eyes about the room and replied, Thought I'd find you playing house, as 2 men entered from behind him. Elizabeth refused to back down and said, Get out. Don't reckon I will, the boss said. Are these yours or part of the trade? He asked, pointing to the bundle of pelts in the corner. She held a poker in her hands. Didn't shudder. You branded me, she whispered softly. You believe I've forgotten? The woman swung when one of the males reached for her, and the poker caught him in the he staggered and cursed as he made the second attack. But a blur went to the quiet. Quick, and enraged, he walked into the open doorway and said, Tack him. Up. The lights smashed, fire licking up the wall. The room exploded into chaos, and the man was knocked down with the force of a fallen tree. Smoke and light. Voss pulled out his rifle. Tacoma sped up. He knocked the sheriff's arm wide. The noise shattered the darkness as the bullet struck the ceiling. Elizabeth picked up the downed weapon and pointed it with both hands, sending birds shrieking from the woods. Leave, she murmured, and the sheriff wiped blood from his eyes and chin. He muttered, You just made your choice, as he shifted from her to. I had already made it, she said. They backed off, hurt, ashamed, eyes blazing with more than hate. Tacoma helped put out the fires as the smoke cleared. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The scent of pine and ash filled the air as Elizabeth sank knees to her chest on the floor, her scar pulsing like a new wound. Tacoma squatted next to her, his face blank. Then, gradually, he reached out gently, and although she recoiled, he was unaffected. His fingers touched the edge of a ripped dress. He asked her a silent inquiry, and after she gave him one nod, he lifted just enough of the garment to expose the scar. It gleamed in the firelight, unsightly and unpolished, a mark designed to demolish. But his eyes remained unflinching, and he covered it with his hand without pressing, merely covering. Then he raised his head, looked her in the eyes, and muttered, Mine, not as claim, not as possession, but as acknowledgement. As though the word on her flesh had always belonged to someone who recognized its reality. She took a deep breath. Her eyes ached and her throat constricted, but instead of crying, she leaned against they sat like that for a long time. And when he stood up, he felt his heartbeat just enough to feel it through his chest. He simply touched her hair tenderly and went out into the night without saying anything. The world was silent as she watched him go into the trees, the darkness drawing in behind him like a curtain. Nothing was silent anymore. She fixed the shattered frame, swept the ash off the floor, and restitched the she wore dress, and for the first time in months, she braided her hair back in the morning. The breeze outside carried more than dust now. It held something in weight. She was no longer scared of it, but she had no idea what would happen next. After that night, the dry creek and air became colder, not because of the weather, but because of how people started to gaze over their shoulders, not out loud or in the open, but distrust had a sound, and it rode in silence, quieter than rumors. Looks in too long quiet, in the way Bootil stopped close to her cabin and never approached. Before the town even moved, Elizabeth could feel it in her bones. Something was developing. She had spent enough time in when the shadow of brutality began to stir. Sheriff Voss didn't come back the following day, but his absence was pressure, a silence that was about to burst, not a peace. Her mornings were devoted to honing tools, fixing what could be fixed, and collecting blood-calming herbs. Not because she was determined not to abandon the property, so she regained the area she had hand-carved from shame, but she would be prepared. On the third night following the attack, Tacoma reappeared, but he did not bring any presents. Ceremony. He had a deeper, drawn face, as though the wind had dragged him down. He entered for the first time after she opened the door before he did, and neither she nor him said. She poured him a cup of tea, But the awkward quiet between them had vanished, replaced by a language of its own. She whispered, "They'll come back," and he nodded as she observed his hands quiver just enough to reveal what his eyes did not. "This time, they won't come to scare me. They'll come to finish it," said another, gazing into the fires. Their shadows were formed together like ancient spirits merging wood as the light moved across the walls. "You don't must remain. You're not fighting this," he said. I stayed. It was a statement, not an explanation, and she leaned back against the wall and gave him a close look, paying particular attention to the scar down his arm, which was still pale from that first day. Beside the brook, at the wolf pendant that she is currently wearing around her neck, at the manner in which as they sat back to back that night, and her presence no longer made her feel like something chased, but rather like something discovered. On the cabin floor, the fire was low, they spoke less than they imagined, and the silence was no longer vacant. Sacrosanct. Word quickly spread when a rider roared through the village at morning. Reverend Pute had demanded a public reckoning, and the council had accepted it. They stated that in order to defend the community, moral order. By nightfall, Voss would be back, and with more than 2 men. Standing outside her shanty, Elizabeth saw the town as if it were a storm skulking across parched grass. The chapel bell ringing once, the sound spread like a funeral hymn across the grassland. Widow Wren showed up at the path's side before midday, her scarf blown by the wind, her hands gripping a package. She remarked, "They'll try to make it look like justice," adding that she was exhausted but not scared. "They'll talk about sin and safety, using phrases that are too lofty for what they really desire." Elizabeth glanced at the horizon, then back at the elderly woman. "Perhaps," Wren remarked, "they will address a group of people who have already decided to remain silent. When someone begins speaking the truth aloud, quiet ends." Elizabeth accepted the package, which contained 2 items, a clean, hand-stitched, undyed, and, oh, whole, with a solitary silver hairpin. Wren claimed to have seen my mother wearing one that was etched with wild poppies while she stood and didn't win the battle to keep her land, but they did remember her face. Elizabeth already understood why she was receiving it now, so she didn't inquire. As the sun hung low and piercing, sure Voss arrived ahead of a wagon and mounted men followed by Reverend Pute, his Bible clutched tightly like a weapon, black cloak billowing. A crowd gathered, not big, but sufficient. They waited on the outskirts of town for Elizabeth to voluntarily arrive and to make it a spectacle. Wearing the simple outfit, she strode into town with her head held high, the silver pin catching the last of the light. The wolf hovered beneath it, and a serenity emanated from the assurance of choosing more than from a lack of dread. Tacoma, the residents of the town divided as he passed, unsure whether to fear or detest him. He followed her, unarmed and leisurely. More, he merely glanced. At her, not at them. Reverend Pute moved forward first, opening his mouth to speak. "Crowd. This girl, this woman, was once granted favor, a spot in our houses, an opportunity to turn back to morality, but she wasted it, let evil into our life, and now carries sin. On her, you branded me because I love what you taught me to hate." Elizabeth murmured, glancing up at him. "You didn't do it to protect," he said. "You punished me for not being terrified by doing that." Silence. "You wooed a barbarian and showed off his corruption," Pute snapped, his face flushed. "When I was bleeding, she handed me water." Tacoma remarked in a low, scathing voice. "You call that corruption?" One Tacoma's eyes heated, but one of the councilmen said, "This isn't your land, Comanche. You don't get to speak here." With grief, but with rage. "The land was taken long before your words attempted to preserve it. Enough of this. She's coming with us. We'll let her go," the sheriff said, raising his hand. Elizabeth questioned, "What sentence did the judge decide on for me?" "There was no," Voss said. "You were spared when you dragged me from my home. Don't push your luck. I was marked," she continued, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I would rot in quiet as the community spun itself tales of my transgression, but I didn't rot since no one would ever want me. I survived, I recovered, and I recalled." There was complete quiet. Even the wind held its breath. She took a step forward, carefully unbuttoned her dress to expose the scar. "Taken, faded, silver, I'm still here despite the fact that you labeled me as cruel. I believed you when you said survive past it." A 15-year-old boy from a farm amid the crowd gazed down at the say what? A rancher moved on his heels. A woman stroked her mouth. I was never yours to ruin. Elizabeth murmured, her voice lower. Now, but you want. That's enough. Sheriff Voss approached her, his face contorted. He lifted his hand to hit her, but a figure moved, forceful as a storm, swift as instinct. Tacoma moved in front of them, and the sheriff's hand landed on his shoulder rather than her cheek. Then there was silence, simply a void, no weapon pulled, no strike returned. Voss's expression changed as they vibrated with an unspoken promise. He hadn't anticipated hesitancy to be strength. Tacoma replied, touch her again, and I will not remain motionless. A voice in the crowd said behind them, leave them alone. Another voice, no one is being harmed. Pewd attempted to speak once again, but the magic was weakening, and Widowren stumbled. You asked us to think she was unfit because of the scar, yet observe her standing there, speaking without hesitation. Someone clapped from the crowd's edge. Slowly. Yes, you labeled her a disgrace. I call her a miracle. Propagated. One man, then another, and then stillness once more, but this time it was a different silence. One that indicated a change. The preacher took a step back, and the sheriff lowered his hand. Elizabeth inhaling. She turned to face Tacoma and, for the first time, grasped his hand in hers. They strolled down the main street together, neither ashamed nor concealed. Street of Dry Creek, beyond the schoolhouse, the shop, and the chapel. The wind increased, but not everyone watched, so one stopped them. Once more, bringing with it the scent of old rain and cedar in her hut. Later that Elizabeth lighted a solitary candle at night and set a silver hairpin next to it. Elizabeth was now complete, and Tacoma sat close to the doorway as light danced over the wood across her name carved above it. Hearth, honing an arrowhead for memory rather than for battle. The rabbit beneath Elizabeth sat while the porch scratched. At the floor once more, and the stars outside glistened like unburyable facts. They tried to murmur to the breeze or to no one else near the window. I refused to leave, but the wind responded. Saw through cracked we spotted a window pane. If you've been stigmatized by shame and you're reading this, by lies, by hands, without my asking, what they attempt to etch into you is not who you are. You're what you decide to construct despite it. Sometimes the greatest rebellion is survival. Additionally, occasionally, just occasionally, someone will exclaim, mine, in reference to your scars, not to take possession of you, but to serve as a reminder that burned ground can grow, and even damaged items will be desired. Have you ever suffered burns because you loved what other people let Elizabeth be your echo? If you've ever been afraid or had a scar that someone else cut into your spirit. Scars do not identify what's fractured. They serve as a reminder of your strengths. Additionally, if someone ever glances at your wound and murmurs, mine, not a claim, but a treasure, be aware that you have been located. Found items include never without value.